I never thought I would go to war with my homeowners association over snow. But then again, I never expected them to fine me $250 for clearing my own driveway either. My name is Richard Donovan, and I have lived in Meadowbrook Estates in Bozeman, Montana for 3 years. When my wife Sandra and I bought our house here, we thought we had found the perfect place to settle down. The neighborhood was clean, the houses were well maintained, and the mountain views were spectacular. What we did not realize was that our HOA president, a woman named Patricia Walters, treated the neighborhood covenants like they were the 10 Commandments handed down from God himself. The trouble started on a Wednesday morning in early February. Montana winters are no joke, and we had gotten hammered with nearly 8 inches of snow overnight. I woke up at 5 in the morning, put on my heavy coat and boots, and went outside to shovel my driveway before heading to work. The sky was still dark and my breath created clouds in the frigid air as I worked. I cleared the driveway systematically, tossing the snow onto my front lawn where it would not block anything. My lawn, my property, or so I thought. I had just finished and was heading inside to warm up with some coffee when I saw Patricia's silver Lexus cruising slowly down the street. She slowed down as she passed my house, and I saw her head turn to look at my freshly shoveled driveway and the piles of snow on my lawn. Even in the dim morning light, I could see her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. I waved, trying to be neighborly despite the early hour. She did not wave back. 3 days later, I found the notice taped to my front door. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with the Meadowbrook Estates logo at the top. The letter informed me that I was in violation of Section 7.4 of the Neighborhood Covenants, which apparently stated that snow removal must not result in unsightly accumulation of snow on visible lawn areas. The fine was $250, payable within 30 days. I read the letter 3 times, certain I must be misunderstanding something. I called Sandra over, and she read it with increasing disbelief. "This cannot be serious," she said, holding the paper up to the light as if looking for a watermark that would reveal it was all a prank. "Where are you supposed to put the snow when you shovel? Into the street. That is illegal." "Apparently, I am supposed to make it disappear," I said, feeling my anger rising. "Or maybe I am just not supposed to shovel at all and let it pile up until spring." I decided to go talk to Patricia directly. She lived in the largest house in the neighborhood, a sprawling 2-story colonial at the end of Maple Drive. When I rang her doorbell that afternoon, she answered wearing a cream-colored sweater set and a string of pearls, as if she had just stepped out of a country club luncheon. "Richard," she said, her tone making it clear she had been expecting me. "I assume you received the violation notice." "I did, and I would like to discuss it," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I do not understand what I did wrong. I shoveled my driveway and put the snow on my own lawn. I did not block the street or the sidewalk." Patricia sighed as if I were a particularly slow child who could not grasp basic arithmetic. "The covenants are very clear. Snow accumulation on visible lawn areas creates an unsightly appearance that diminishes property values for the entire neighborhood. You need to remove snow in a manner that maintains aesthetic standards." "How exactly am I supposed to do that?" I asked. "Should I load it into my truck and drive it somewhere, melt it with a flamethrower?" "There is no need for sarcasm, Richard," Patricia said coldly. "Other residents manage to comply with the rules. Perhaps you could hire a professional snow removal service that understands proper technique." "I have been shoveling my driveway the same way for 3 years," I said. "This is the first time it has been a problem." "The board recently conducted a comprehensive review of covenant compliance," Patricia replied. We discovered numerous violations that had been overlooked by previous administrations. We are simply enforcing the rules that everyone agreed to when they purchased their homes. I want to appeal this fine, I said. There must be a process for that. Patricia's expression suggested I had just announced my intention to paint my house neon pink. You may submit a written appeal to the board, which will be reviewed at our next monthly meeting. However, I should tell you that the board stands united in our commitment to maintaining neighborhood standards. The fine will almost certainly be upheld. I left Patricia's house feeling like I had just been dismissed from the principal's office. When I got home, I pulled out my copy of the neighborhood covenants and read through the entire document. Section 7.4 did indeed mention snow accumulation, though the language was vague enough that I thought a reasonable person could interpret it in multiple ways. I spent the rest of the evening drafting my appeal letter, citing specific passages, and arguing that I had acted in good faith compliance with both the covenants and local ordinances. 2 weeks later, I attended the HOA board meeting to present my case. The meeting was held in Patricia's formal dining room, which had been set up with a long table where the 5 board members sat like judges at a tribunal. Besides Patricia, the board consisted of Harold Chen, a retired accountant, Margaret Baxter, a real estate agent, Timothy Nash, who worked for a local bank, and Deborah Simmons, whose husband owned several car dealerships. I presented my argument calmly and logically, explaining that I had shoveled my snow in the same manner that most homeowners in Montana have done for decades. I pointed out that the snow would melt naturally within a few weeks, and that there was no permanent damage or genuine aesthetic harm to the neighborhood. Patricia listened with her arms crossed, and her expression fixed in what I had come to think of as her disappointed headmistress face. When I finished, she did not even consult with the other board members before responding. "Your appeal is denied," she said flatly. "The covenant language is clear, and your violation is documented with photographic evidence. The fine stands. If it is not paid within the original 30-day time frame, late fees will begin to accumulate at $50 per week." I looked at the other board members, hoping for some sign of reason or sympathy. Harold was studying his hands. Margaret looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Timothy and Deborah both avoided my eyes. "This is ridiculous," I said, my calm finally cracking. "You are fining me for basic home maintenance. We are enforcing the covenants that maintain property values for everyone," Patricia replied. "If you cannot comply with neighborhood standards, perhaps you should consider whether Meadowbrook Estates is the right community for you." The implied threat was clear. I left the meeting furious, my hands shaking as I drove home. Sandra could tell immediately that things had not gone well. "They denied it?" she asked. "Without even a moment's consideration," I said. Patricia had already made up her mind before I walked in the room. The whole appeal process was just theater. "Are you going to pay the fine?" I thought about it. $250 was not insignificant, but it was not going to bankrupt us either. Part of me wanted to just pay it and move on with my life. But another part of me, the part that had grown up in a small town in Wyoming where people took care of their own properties without busybody neighbors sticking their noses in, bristled at the sheer injustice of it. "I will pay it," I said finally. "But I am going to make sure this does not happen again." Over the next few days, I researched snow removal methods that might satisfy Patricia's vague aesthetic standards. I looked into snow melting systems, but they cost thousands of dollars to install. I considered hiring a service to haul the snow away, but that would cost hundreds of dollars every time it snowed heavily, which in Montana was often. Finally, I stumbled across something interesting while reading the covenants again. The covenants restricted what I could do with my own property, but they said nothing about common areas or the streets. And technically, the entrance to the neighborhood, where Patricia and the other board members lived, was maintained by the HOA as a common area. The driveways were private property, but the area immediately adjacent to them was not. An idea began forming in my mind. It was petty, childish even, but the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. I was not going to break any laws. I was not going to damage anyone's property. I was simply going to give Patricia and her board a taste of their own medicine. The next major snowstorm was forecast for the following week. The Weather Service was predicting anywhere from 12 to 18 inches, with high winds creating significant drifting. I made my preparations carefully. I borrowed a large snowblower from my friend Dave, who owned a landscaping business. It was an industrial-grade machine, much more powerful than the average homeowner model, with a discharge chute that could throw snow nearly 40 feet. "What do you need this beast for?" Dave asked as we loaded it into my truck. "Your driveway is not that big." "I've got a special project in mind," I said. "I will explain later." I also invested in a good quality snow shovel, some ice melt, and several thermoses for coffee. This was going to be an all-day job, and I wanted to be prepared. The storm hit on a Saturday night. I stayed up late watching the snow accumulate, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about what I was planning. Sandra knew something was up, but when she asked me about it, I just kissed her forehead and told her not to worry. By Sunday morning, we had 16 inches of fresh powder, and it was still coming down lightly. The wind had created drifts that were even deeper in some places. It was perfect. I got up at 4 in the morning, dressed in my warmest clothes, and loaded the snow blower into my truck along with my other supplies. The streets were deserted as I drove toward the entrance of the neighborhood. Maple Drive, where Patricia and the other board members lived, formed a cul-de-sac at the far end of Meadowbrook Estates. Their houses were the largest and most expensive in the development, set back from the street with long driveways. During the night, the snow had piled up everywhere, creating a winter wonderland that would have been beautiful if I were not so focused on my mission. I parked my truck at the entrance to Maple Drive and unloaded the snow blower. The machine roared to life with a deep, powerful growl that echoed through the quiet morning. I started with the common areas, clearing the snow systematically, but with a very specific purpose in mind. Instead of blowing the snow onto the nearby lawns or into piles out of the way, I directed every single ounce of it toward the driveways of the 5 board members. I started with Patricia's house. Her driveway was long and curved, lined with decorative lampposts that probably cost more than my first car. I positioned the snow blower carefully and began creating a wall of snow across her driveway entrance. The machine threw snow in a high, arcing stream, and I worked methodically to build up the barrier. When I was done with the entrance, I moved along the common area adjacent to her property and continued adding to the pile. The wind was actually helping me, creating additional drifting that made the accumulation even more dramatic. By the time I finished with Patricia's driveway, there was a solid wall of snow at least 6 feet high blocking her exit. The morning sun was starting to rise, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Under other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. I moved on to Harold's house next. His driveway was shorter but steeper, which made the snow piling even more effective. I buried his driveway entrance completely, creating a barrier that would require hours of work to clear. Then came Margaret's house, then Timothy's, and finally Deborah's. By the time I was done, it was nearly 11 in the morning and I was exhausted but deeply satisfied. The snow blower went back in my truck, and I drove home slowly, admiring my handiwork. Every single board member who had voted to uphold my ridiculous fine now had a driveway that was completely impassable, and I had not broken a single law. I had cleared snow from common areas, which the HOA was actually supposed to maintain anyway. Where that snow ended up was simply a matter of physics and wind patterns. I got home, took a long hot shower, and collapsed into bed for a nap. Sandra woke me up a few hours later, her expression somewhere between amused and concerned. "Did you do something to the board members' driveways?" she asked. "I may have relocated some snow from the common areas," I said innocently. Patricia called. She was very upset. She used words I did not know she knew. I sat up, suddenly alert. "What did she say?" "She said you deliberately sabotaged her driveway and the other board members' driveways. She is threatening to fine you again, maybe even take legal action." "She cannot prove anything," I said. "I cleared common areas that the HOA is responsible for maintaining. It is not my fault where the snow ended up." "Richard, this is getting out of hand," Sandra said, but I could see she was trying not to smile. "Those people have to be able to get out of their driveways." "They can shovel," I said, "just like I had to shovel mine, although I hope they do not put the snow on their lawns because that would be creating an unsightly accumulation." The next 48 hours were chaos. Patricia left 3 more increasingly angry voicemails, each one threatening more severe consequences than the last. I did not return her calls. Harold sent me a formal letter demanding compensation for the snow removal service he had to hire, which cost him $400. I sent back a letter suggesting he appeal to the HOA board for relief. On Tuesday afternoon, I received a notice that an emergency board meeting had been called for Thursday evening. My attendance was mandatory. The notice claimed I had violated multiple covenants and engaged in behavior detrimental to the neighborhood. I was facing potential fines of up to $5,000 and possible legal action. I called a lawyer. His name was Frank Morrison, and he had handled our house closing when we bought the property. I explained the situation to him over the phone, and I could hear him chuckling. "So let me get this straight," Frank said. "They fined you for putting snow on your own lawn, so you buried their driveways using snow from common areas." "That is essentially correct," I said. "And you did not trespass on private property or damage anything." "No, I stayed on common areas and public right-of-way the entire time." "This is fantastic," Frank said. "I mean, it is petty and ridiculous, but from a legal standpoint you are probably in the clear. They might try to fine you anyway, but I think we have a strong case for arguing that their covenants are being enforced in an arbitrary and capricious manner." "Can you come to the meeting with me?" I asked. "Absolutely. I would not miss this for anything." Thursday evening arrived cold and clear. I drove to Patricia's house with Frank, who was dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase full of documents. When we walked into the dining room where the board was assembled, Patricia's expression went from smug to alarmed. "What is he doing here?" she demanded, pointing at Frank. "Richard has the right to legal representation," Frank said smoothly. "I am here to ensure that this proceeding is conducted fairly and in accordance with Montana law." The meeting was contentious from the start. Patricia presented her case with righteous indignation, claiming that I had deliberately sabotaged the board members' properties out of spite. She showed photographs of the buried driveways, which I had to admit looked pretty impressive. The snow walls were solid and imposing, definitely the work of someone who knew what they were doing. When it was my turn to respond, Frank took over. He was brilliant, systematically dismantling every argument Patricia made. He pointed out that the HOA was required to maintain common areas, which I had actually done for them. He noted that the covenants contained no specific restrictions on snow removal from common areas. He produced records showing that the HOA had not maintained the common areas properly all winter, which was technically a breach of their own responsibilities. Then Frank went for the throat. He pulled out a thick document and slid it across the table to Patricia. "This is a complaint I prepared for filing with the Montana Commissioner of Securities and Insurance," he said. "It alleges that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA has been enforcing covenants in an arbitrary, discriminatory, and legally questionable manner. It cites numerous examples, including the fine levied against Richard for basic snow removal. If filed, this complaint will trigger a formal investigation that could result in significant penalties for the board members personally." Patricia's face went pale. "You cannot do that." "I absolutely can," Frank said. "And if this board votes to impose any additional fines on Richard, I will file it tomorrow morning. Additionally, Richard will file suit in district court seeking reimbursement of the original fine, plus legal fees and damages." Montana courts have consistently held that HOA covenants must be reasonable and enforced uniformly. I am confident we would prevail. The room fell silent. Harold was staring at the complaint document like it was a venomous snake. Margaret looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. Timothy and Deborah were whispering urgently to each other. "You cannot threaten this board," Patricia said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I am not threatening," Frank replied. "I am informing you of the legal consequences of your actions. You have a choice. You can drop all fines against Richard, revise your enforcement policies to be more reasonable, and we can all move on with our lives. Or we can escalate this into a protracted legal battle that will cost everyone time, money, and peace of mind." Patricia looked at the other board members. I could see her trying to rally them to maintain her authority, but the fight had gone out of them. Harold spoke first. "I think we should take a 5-minute recess to discuss this privately," he said. Frank and I stepped outside into the cold night air. My heart was pounding and I felt slightly dizzy with adrenaline. "You think they will back down?" I asked. "Probably," Frank said. "Patricia is stubborn, but the others know they are on shaky legal ground. Plus, an investigation would be a nightmare for all of them. HOA board members can be held personally liable for certain violations." 10 minutes later, we were called back inside. Patricia looked like she had been chewing glass, but Harold was the one who spoke. "The board has voted to rescind the fine against Richard," he said. "Additionally, we will be conducting a comprehensive review of our covenant enforcement policies to ensure they are being applied reasonably and consistently." "What about compensation for the snow removal costs?" Patricia interjected. "That will not be necessary," Frank said. "Richard performed a service by clearing common areas. Consider it his contribution to neighborhood maintenance." We left shortly after that, and I felt like I was floating as we walked to the car. Frank shook my hand and grinned. "That was fun," he said. "Send me a check for $500 and we will call it even." "Worth every penny," I said. I thought that would be the end of it. The fine was rescinded, Patricia had been put in her place, and life could return to normal. But I had underestimated how deep Patricia's need for control ran, and how poorly she handled being challenged. 3 weeks later, I received another violation notice. This time, I was being cited for having Christmas lights up past February 1st, which apparently violated the covenant provision about seasonal decorations. The fine was $100. The problem was, I did not have Christmas lights up. I had taken them down in early January, just like I did every year. I took pictures of my house from multiple angles, clearly showing no lights, and sent them to the HOA with a strongly worded letter pointing out that they were now citing me for violations that did not exist. 2 days after that, I got another notice claiming my trash cans were visible from the street, which violated aesthetic standards. My trash cans were in my garage where they had always been. More photos, another letter. Then came a citation for my mailbox being the wrong color. It was black, the same color it had been for 3 years. Apparently it needed to be dark green to match neighborhood standards. I checked my original covenant documents and found no such requirement. Patricia was harassing me, pure and simple. Every few days brought a new bogus violation notice. Frank sent her a cease and desist letter, warning that we would file a harassment lawsuit if it continued. The notices stopped for about a week, then started up again. "She is losing it," Sandra said one evening as we looked at the latest violation notice, this one claiming our lawn had unauthorized plantings. "This is becoming obsessive." "I need to figure out what she is really up to," I said. "This is not just about the snow anymore." I started doing some research into the HOA's finances and operations. Montana law requires HOAs to maintain certain records and make them available to homeowners upon request. I submitted a formal request for the last 3 years of financial statements, meeting minutes, and vendor contracts. Patricia tried to refuse, claiming the documents were confidential. Frank sent another letter explaining that she was legally required to provide them. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived with copies of everything I had requested. I spent an entire weekend going through the documents, and what I found made my anger turn into something much more serious. The HOA had hired a property management company called Elite Neighborhood Services 2 years ago. According to the contract, Elite was being paid $15,000 a year to handle covenant enforcement, vendor coordination, and administrative tasks. The problem was, I could not find any evidence that Elite actually existed as a legitimate company. Their business address was a P.O. box. They had no website, no phone listing, no online presence whatsoever. And when I looked at the canceled checks paid to Elite, every single one had been endorsed and deposited into an account at Mountain West Bank. Patricia's husband worked at Mountain West Bank. He was a branch manager. I called Frank immediately and explained what I had found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Frank asked. "I think Patricia has been embezzling HOA funds," I said. "Elite Neighborhood Services is probably a shell company. She has been paying herself $15,000 a year to do work she is supposed to be doing as a volunteer board member." "That is fraud," Frank said quietly. "That is criminal. What do I do? Let me make some calls. Do not do anything or tell anyone yet. If this is what it looks like, we need to handle it very carefully." Over the next few days, Frank worked with a forensic accountant to trace the money. It was worse than I had initially thought. Elite Neighborhood Services had been receiving payments for 3 years, not 2, totaling $45,000. The company was registered as an LLC in Delaware, with Patricia listed as the registered agent under her maiden name. The bank account receiving the deposits was jointly held by Patricia and her husband, Gerald. Frank contacted the other board members and presented the evidence. Harold nearly had a heart attack when he saw the documents. Margaret started crying. Timothy and Deborah looked shell-shocked. "We had no idea," Harold kept saying. "We approved the contract with Elite because Patricia said they came highly recommended. We never thought to verify anything." "You need to contact the police," Frank told them. "This is embezzlement and fraud. It is criminal. Patricia was arrested the following week at her home. The Bozeman Police Department took the case seriously, especially when the investigation revealed that Gerald had been complicit in the scheme. He had helped set up the shell company and the bank account, and had been actively concealing the deposits from scrutiny. The neighborhood erupted in scandal. Patricia had been the HOA president for 5 years, and the realization that she had been stealing from the community the entire time sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook Estates. Other homeowners came forward with their own stories of excessive fines and harassment, painting a picture of a woman who had used her position for both financial gain and personal power. The legal proceedings took months. Patricia initially tried to claim that Elite was a legitimate company and she had been providing real services. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming. There were no records of any actual work being performed, no time sheets, no legitimate business operations. It was a straightforward embezzlement scheme that had worked for years because no one thought to question the HOA president. In September, Patricia pleaded guilty to felony theft and fraud charges. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though the judge agreed to allow her to serve the time in a minimum security facility. Gerald pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received 2 years probation plus a substantial fine. They were also ordered to pay restitution of $45,000 to the HOA, plus interest and penalties. The neighborhood spent months recovering from the scandal. The HOA board was completely restructured, with new elections held and new bylaws established to prevent similar abuses. One of the first actions of the new board was to revise the covenant enforcement policies, making them clearer and more reasonable. The vague language about snow accumulation was removed entirely and replaced with common-sense guidelines that basically said homeowners should maintain their properties in a neat and safe manner. I was actually asked to join the new board, but I declined. I had no interest in getting involved in neighborhood politics after everything that had happened. I just wanted to live in my house, shovel my snow onto my lawn when necessary, and be left alone. One evening in October, as Sandra and I sat on our back deck watching the sun set over the mountains, she brought up everything that had happened. "You regret it?" she asked. "The whole snowblower thing, I mean. If you had just paid the fine and moved on, you would not have gotten dragged into all of this." I thought about it for a while before answering. "No, I do not regret it. If I had not pushed back, Patricia would still be stealing from everyone and making people's lives miserable. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it would be easier to just give in. Even when it means burying their driveways in 6 feet of snow," I grinned. Especially then. Winter came again, bringing with it the first major snowstorm of the season. I got up early on a Saturday morning, put on my coat and boots, and went outside to shovel my driveway. The cold air stung my lungs and my breath created clouds in the darkness. I cleared the driveway methodically, tossing the snow onto my front lawn where it created neat white piles. When I finished, I stood for a moment admiring my work. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, painting streaks of orange and pink across the horizon. It was going to be a beautiful day. My driveway was clear, the snow was on my lawn where it would not hurt anything, and there would be no violation notices taped to my door. Dave pulled up in his truck just as I was putting my shovel away. He rolled down his window and called out, "Need to borrow the snow blower again." "Not this year," I called back, "but thanks for the offer." He laughed and drove off, probably heading to one of his landscaping jobs. I went inside to the warmth of my house, where Sandra had coffee waiting and breakfast cooking on the stove. Through the kitchen window, I could see my cleared driveway and snow-covered lawn. It looked exactly like it was supposed to look, exactly like dozens of other houses in neighborhoods all across Montana. The new HOA board had sent out a newsletter the week before, outlining their priorities for the coming year. It included things like organizing neighborhood social events, coordinating bulk trash pickup, and maintaining the common areas. There was no mention of aggressive covenant enforcement or aesthetic standards, just common sense guidelines for being good neighbors. Harold had resigned from the board after the scandal, too embarrassed by his failure to catch Patricia's fraud. Margaret had stayed on but was much more cautious and measured in her approach. 2 new members had been elected, including a retired teacher named Susan Richardson, who had immediately advocated for reducing the HOA's power and focusing on community building rather than rule enforcement. At the first meeting of the new board, Susan had proposed rescinding dozens of old violation notices that had been issued under Patricia's regime. The board had voted unanimously to clear everyone's slate and start fresh. It felt like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled after years of holding its breath. I ran into Timothy at the hardware store a few weeks after Patricia's sentencing. He looked older than I remembered, tired and worn down. When he saw me, he hesitated, then walked over. "Richard," he said, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I should have stood up to Patricia when she was targeting you. I should have questioned the elite contract. I should have been a better board member and neighbor." "Water under the bridge," I said, though part of me was still angry at how easily the board had gone along with Patricia's schemes. "I keep thinking about that meeting where we upheld your fine," Timothy continued. "You were right to be angry. The whole thing was absurd. But Patricia had this way of making you feel like questioning her was questioning the entire foundation of the neighborhood. She made it seem like if we did not enforce every tiny rule, the whole community would fall apart. She was manipulating all of you," I said, "and stealing from everyone at the same time. I know, and I will have to live with the fact that I let it happen." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "The thing is, after you buried our driveways, I was furious. It took me 4 hours to clear mine, and I threw my back out doing it. But looking back now, I am almost grateful. If you had not pushed back so hard, we might never have discovered what Patricia was doing. She could have kept stealing for years." We talked for a few more minutes, and I left feeling slightly better about the whole situation. Timothy had been weak rather than malicious, and he clearly felt genuine remorse. It was more than Patricia had ever shown. The criminal trial had been fascinating to watch, in a dark sort of way. Patricia's defense attorney had tried to argue that she had genuinely believed she was entitled to compensation for her work as HOA president. But the prosecution had methodically destroyed that argument by showing how she had deliberately concealed the payments, created a shell company, and lied to the other board members about Elite's legitimacy. The most damning evidence had come from Patricia's own records. She had kept meticulous notes about her HOA activities, apparently planning to use them to justify the payments if she was ever questioned. But those notes had backfired spectacularly, because they showed that she spent an average of less than 5 hours a month on actual HOA business. The rest of the time, she was using her position to harass homeowners she did not like, including me, and to maintain her sense of power and control over the neighborhood. The forensic psychologist who testified at sentencing had described Patricia as having narcissistic personality disorder with controlling tendencies. She genuinely believed that she was superior to her neighbors, and that the rules she enforced protected the neighborhood from people who did not meet her standards. The money, according to the psychologist, was almost secondary to the power and control she exercised through her position. Gerald's role had been more passive but still culpable. He had gone along with Patricia's scheme because he was conflict-averse and, according to his own testimony, afraid of his wife's temper. He had lost his job at the bank immediately after his arrest, and the couple's financial situation had collapsed. They had been forced to put their house up for sale to pay legal fees and restitution, and the asking price had been dropped twice because potential buyers were put off by the house's association with the scandal. The Meadowbrook Estates community had struggled with how to move forward. Some homeowners wanted to simply forget the whole thing and pretend it had never happened. Others, particularly those who had been targeted by Patricia's excessive fines over the years, wanted to pursue civil lawsuits for harassment and emotional distress. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and the focus shifted to rebuilding trust and creating better oversight mechanisms. The new HOA board implemented several reforms that probably should have been in place all along. All financial transactions over $500 now required approval from at least 3 board members. Monthly financial statements were posted online where any homeowner could review them. Board meetings were recorded, and minutes were distributed to everyone in the neighborhood. And most importantly, a clear appeals process was established for any covenant violation, with the requirement that at least one board member who was not involved in the original decision had to review the appeal. These changes seemed basic and obvious in hindsight, but they represented a fundamental shift in how the HOA operated. Instead of being Patricia's personal fiefdom, it became what it was supposed to be all along: a democratic organization focused on maintaining common areas and mediating disputes among neighbors. Spring came to Montana with its usual dramatic flair, the snow melting rapidly and revealing lawns that had been buried for months. My front lawn, which had been the site of so much controversy the previous winter, looked a bit rough in spots where the snow had been piled particularly deep. But it greened up nicely once the weather warmed, and by June it was as healthy as ever. Sandra and I started actually getting to know our neighbors beyond the surface-level waves and small talk. Without Patricia's oppressive presence hanging over the neighborhood, people seemed more relaxed and friendly. We were invited to a block party in July, something that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Patricia had actively discouraged neighborhood social events, probably because she could not control them as easily as formal HOA meetings. At the block party, I ended up in a conversation with several neighbors about the whole saga. Everyone had their own Patricia story, it turned out. There was Mike Reynolds, who had been fined for having a garden gnome in his yard that supposedly violated aesthetic standards. There was Jennifer Kramer, who had received violation notices because her teenage son's car was parked on the street overnight instead of in the garage. There was elderly Walter Hughes, who had been cited for letting his grass grow a quarter-inch longer than the permitted height because he had been in the hospital recovering from surgery. She was awful to everyone, Jennifer said, shaking her head. But she was so confident and authoritative that most people just assumed she must be right. My husband and I paid probably $1,500 in bogus fines over the years because we thought we had to. I tried to run against her for board president once, Mike added. This was about 4 years ago. Patricia launched a whisper campaign claiming I was trying to take over the HOA to benefit my contracting business. It was complete nonsense, but enough people believed it that I withdrew from the race. The stories kept coming, painting a picture of years of petty tyranny that everyone had simply endured because challenging Patricia seemed too difficult or risky. I realized that my snowblower revenge, as childish as it might have been, had been the catalyst that finally brought everything to light. If I had just paid that first fine and moved on, Patricia would still be running the neighborhood like her personal kingdom and stealing money from everyone. As autumn arrived again and the leaves started changing colors, I found myself thinking about the whole experience with a mixture of amusement and residual anger. The snowblower incident had become legendary in the neighborhood, with the story getting more exaggerated with each retelling. In some versions, I had buried the board members' driveways so deeply that they could not get out of their houses for days. In others, I had used some kind of industrial snow-making machine to create artificial blizzards targeting specific homes. The truth was more mundane, but still satisfying. I had taken a petty, unjust fine and responded with an act of creative civil disobedience that ultimately exposed a much larger crime. It was not something I had planned or anticipated, but looking back, I would not have changed a thing. December came around again, bringing with it the anniversary of the original snow shoveling incident that had started everything. The first major storm of the season hit on a weeknight, dropping about 10 inches of heavy, wet snow that was perfect for packing. I got up early the next morning, as I always did, and went out to shovel my driveway. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful in the early morning darkness. I could see lights on in a few houses where other early risers were having their coffee and preparing for the day. The snow was fresh and clean, unmarred by footprints or tire tracks. My breath created clouds in the cold air as I worked, and despite the physical effort, I found the activity meditative and calming. When I finished clearing the driveway, I looked at the piles of snow on my lawn and felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or getting even. This was my house, my property, my responsibility. I had maintained it in a reasonable way that harmed no one and served a practical purpose. And no one was going to fine me, harass me, or make me feel like I had done something wrong. As I was putting my shovel away, Susan Richardson drove slowly past in her Subaru, navigating carefully through the snowy streets. She rolled down her window and called out, "Nice work, Richard. Stay warm." "You too," I called back, waving. It was a simple, neighborly exchange, the kind of thing that should have been normal all along. But after everything that had happened, it felt significant. This was what community was supposed to be. People looking out for each other, respecting each other's property and choices, and working together when necessary without someone trying to control and dominate everyone else. I went inside to where Sandra was making breakfast, and the smell of bacon and coffee filled the kitchen. Through the window, I could see my cleared driveway and the snow on my lawn, ordinary and unremarkable, just the way it should be. "Another successful snow removal operation," Sandra said with a smile. "The most boring one yet," I replied, and I could not be happier about it. We ate breakfast together while watching the morning news, which was reporting on the snowstorm and the traffic delays it had caused. There was no mention of HOA disputes, embezzlement scandals, or buried driveways. Just normal life in Montana during winter, which was exactly what I wanted. Frank called later that morning to check in. He had become something of a friend through the whole ordeal, and we occasionally grabbed lunch or met for drinks. "How is your driveway looking?" he asked with amusement in his voice. "Properly cleared, with snow on my lawn and no violation notices in sight," I said. "The dream," Frank replied. "Listen, I wanted to let you know that Patricia's appeal was denied. She is officially going to serve her full sentence, minus time for good behavior." "How long will that actually be?" "Probably around 2 years, given the mandatory minimums and her lack of prior record." Gerald has already completed his probation, from what I understand. He moved out of state to live with his sister. I do not think he will be coming back to Bozeman. I almost feel sorry for him, I said. He seemed more weak than evil. He knowingly participated in a fraud scheme, Frank reminded me. But I get what you mean. Patricia was clearly the driving force. Anyway, I thought you would want to know. You can officially close this chapter of your life. After we hung up, I sat for a while thinking about everything that had happened. An absurd fine for shoveling snow had escalated into a personal war with the HOA president, which had then exposed a years-long embezzlement scheme and resulted in criminal convictions. It was not a story I could have predicted or imagined when I first moved to Meadowbrook Estates, but through it all, I had learned some important lessons. I learned that standing up to bullies and unjust authority was important, even when it would be easier to just comply. I learned that small acts of resistance could have unexpected consequences, sometimes revealing larger truths that needed to be exposed. And I learned that community was not about rules and covenants and enforcing conformity. It was about people treating each other with respect and decency. The snow on my lawn eventually melted, as it always did. Spring came again, then summer, then autumn. Life in Meadowbrook Estates continued, but it was different now. Better. The neighborhood felt less like a tightly controlled subdivision, and more like an actual community where people chose to live, because they liked the area and their neighbors, not because they were afraid of violating some obscure covenant. I still shoveled my driveway every time it snowed, and I still put the snow on my lawn. It had become almost symbolic for me, a small act of independence and self-determination. No one ever complained or fined me. The new HOA board had more important things to worry about, like organizing community events and maintaining the playground equipment in the neighborhood park. On a cold January evening, almost exactly 2 years after the original incident, I received an unexpected piece of mail. It was a handwritten letter with no return address, postmarked from Billings. I opened it curiously and immediately recognized the handwriting as Patricia's. The letter was brief and formal, clearly written after significant thought and possibly legal advice. Patricia wrote that she was taking responsibility for her actions and acknowledged the harm she had caused to the community and to me specifically. She did not make excuses or try to justify what she had done. She simply apologized and stated that she hoped I could someday forgive her, though she understood if I could not. I read the letter twice, trying to figure out how I felt about it. There was no way to know if Patricia's remorse was genuine or if this was just another manipulation, an attempt to look good for potential parole hearings. But ultimately, I decided it did not matter. I had moved on with my life, and whether Patricia had actually changed or learned anything from her experience was between her and her conscience. I showed the letter to Sandra, and we talked about it for a while before I decided not to respond. Some chapters needed to be closed completely, with no final correspondence or acknowledgement. Patricia had caused enough disruption in my life, and I was not interested in maintaining any connection to her, even a hostile one. Instead, I filed the letter away in a folder with all the other documents from that period. Violation notices, legal correspondence, news articles about the scandal, and the receipt from Frank for his legal services. Someday, maybe years from now, I would look back at these documents and remember how a simple dispute about snow removal had changed my neighborhood and taught me valuable lessons about justice, community, and standing up for what was right. But for now, I was content to live my life, shovel my snow, and enjoy the peace that came from knowing I had fought a battle worth fighting and won something important, not just for myself but for everyone in Meadowbrook Estates. The snow would keep falling every winter, and I would keep clearing my driveway, and life would continue in its ordinary, beautiful way. That was all I had ever really wanted. Just to be left alone to maintain my property in a reasonable manner, to be a good neighbor, and to live in a community where petty tyranny did not masquerade as civic responsibility. Thanks to one act of creative snow placement, that was exactly what I had.